Michael Davis stood in the dimly lit dining area of his once thriving restaurant, Blue Moon Diner. The once lively chatter of customers was long gone, replaced by an eerie silence. Dust gathered on the tables and chairs, and the kitchen, once filled with the delicious aromas of sizzling steaks and freshly baked bread, now sat cold and lifeless. Bills were piled up on the counter, unpaid for months, and the "for sale" sign out front seemed to mock him every time he walked by. He had poured his heart and soul into this place, but it wasn't enough. The diner had been his dream, something he and his late wife, Rachel, had built from scratch. But when she passed away 2 years ago, everything changed. Michael tried to keep the business afloat, but with mounting debts and a heart weighed down by grief, it seemed like the universe had conspired against him. Michael ran a tired hand through his unkempt hair, staring blankly at the register that hadn't rung in weeks. It was just another reminder of his failure. The restaurant was set to be sold in a matter of weeks, a necessary evil to dig himself out of the hole he had fallen into. Yet the thought of walking away felt like betraying Rachel's memory. His thoughts were interrupted by the creak of the front door opening. Instinctively, Michael turned, half hoping a customer might have wandered in, though he knew it was impossible. Instead, standing in the doorway was a woman, disheveled, clothes torn and dirty, with a small girl clinging to her side. The woman's eyes were sunken, her face etched with exhaustion and desperation. The child, no older than 6, had the same hollow look, but there was something in her eyes, an innocence that hadn't been entirely lost to the world yet. "Excuse me," the woman's voice was shaky, her words barely audible. "I'm sorry to bother you, but we don't have anywhere to go." Michael blinked, unsure of how to respond. This was the kind of thing you saw in movies or heard about in distant news reports, not something you faced in your empty restaurant on a Monday afternoon. He cleared his throat awkwardly, trying to pull himself together. "Do you need food?" he asked, already feeling for his wallet, though he knew there was little left in it. The woman shook her head quickly. "No, I'm not asking for money or food. I noticed your sign. The place is for sale?" Michael hesitated, nodding slowly. "Yeah, it is." She bit her lip, glancing down at her daughter before continuing. "I was just wondering if maybe we could stay here for a few nights? Just until I can figure out where to go. I can clean. I can help around the place. Anything you need, really?" Her plea was unexpected, and Michael could feel a knot tightening in his stomach. He was in no position to help anyone. He could barely help himself. But something about the way the little girl clung to her mother's leg, eyes wide and pleading, tugged at him. Maybe it was because Sarah, his daughter, would have been around her age if she were still alive. "How long are we talking about?" Michael asked, his voice coming out harsher than intended. He immediately regretted it, seeing the woman flinch. Just a few days. I promise we won't cause any trouble. We'll be out before you know it," she said quickly, her voice tight with desperation. The girl remained silent, but her eyes stayed locked on Michael, as if silently begging for his kindness. He sighed deeply, looking around the empty restaurant. What difference would it make? No one was coming here, and he wasn't even sure when the place would sell. Maybe it was the right thing to do, the human thing to do. Rachel always believed in helping people when they needed it most, no matter how little you had to give. Michael nodded slowly. "All right, you can stay in the back room for now. It's not much, but it's better than nothing." The woman's eyes filled with tears, and she quickly wiped them away, trying to maintain her composure. Thank you so much. Name's Michael, by the way," he added, gesturing toward the back of the diner. "Come on, I'll show you where you can stay." "Emily," she replied, her voice still trembling. "And this is my daughter, Sarah." Michael led them through the kitchen and into the small and used storage room that had once been a break area for staff. It was dusty, cramped, and far from comfortable, but Emily seemed grateful for even that. Sarah, still silent, clutched a worn-out teddy bear to her chest as she followed her mother inside. "I'll find you some blankets," Michael said, stepping back toward the door. "Make yourselves at home." As he left the room, the reality of what he had just done began to settle in. He had invited 2 strangers into his space, 2 people with stories he knew nothing about. And yet, For the first time in a long while, he felt like he had done something good, something that Rachel would have been proud of. But deep down, there was also a gnawing sense of unease. He couldn't put his finger on it, but something about Emily's eyes, the desperation, the sadness, and the secrecy behind them, kept replaying in his mind long after he had left them to rest. The next few days passed quietly, though not without a certain tension in the air. Emily and Sarah kept mostly to themselves, using the small back room as their shelter. Michael rarely saw them, aside from early mornings when he heard Emily shuffling through the kitchen, cleaning up despite his insistence that she didn't have to. One morning, while wiping down the counter, Michael heard a soft voice behind him. He turned to see Sarah standing in the doorway, clutching her teddy bear. "Hi," she whispered, her wide eyes scanning the room like she was afraid of being scolded for speaking. Michael smiled, trying to ease her nerves. "Hey there, did you sleep okay?" Sarah nodded, but didn't say more. Her small fingers fidgeted with the bear's worn-out ear. Michael noticed how thin she was, the sleeves of her jacket hanging loosely around her wrists. He wondered how long she and Emily had been on the streets, how long they had been living like this, barely scraping by, invisible to everyone except each other. "You want some breakfast?" Michael asked, nodding toward the stove. "I was about to make some eggs." Sarah's eyes lit up, and for a second, the shadow of hunger she wore seemed to lift. She nodded eagerly, and Michael couldn't help but chuckle at her sudden enthusiasm. "All right, eggs it is." As he cracked the eggs into the pan, the sizzling sound filled the quiet space. Sarah stood by the counter, watching intently. Michael caught her peeking at the food with obvious longing, and his heart clenched. How many mornings had she gone without a proper meal? Too many, he guessed. "Do you like ketchup on your eggs?" Michael asked, trying to keep the conversation light. She nodded again, her eyes glued to the pan as if it were the most magical thing she'd ever seen. Michael grabbed a plate, sliding the eggs onto it before squirting a generous amount of ketchup on top. He placed it in front of her, watching as she cautiously sat down at the counter, her feet barely touching the floor. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice so quiet it almost got lost in the sounds of the kitchen. "You're welcome, kiddo," Michael said, grabbing a second plate for himself. As they ate, a strange silence filled the room, comfortable, yet heavy with unspoken words. Sarah ate slowly at first, as if she wasn't sure if she was allowed to enjoy it, but eventually, she picked up the pace, devouring the food like it was the first real meal she'd had in days. "Do you go to school?" Michael asked gently, hoping not to overstep. Sarah paused, her fork hovering in midair. "No, we move a lot," she mumbled, her gaze dropping to her plate. Michael's chest tightened. A little girl, wandering from place to place, never having the stability of friends or a classroom. It hit him harder than he expected. Rachel had always dreamed of them having a family. Kids running around the diner, Michael cooking them breakfast before they rushed off to school. That dream died with her, but sitting here with Sarah, he could almost imagine it again. Just then, Emily appeared in the doorway. Her hair was damp, like she had washed up in the small sink in the back. She saw Sarah at the counter and froze, her eyes narrowing slightly as if she expected Michael to scold them for some unspoken rule they'd broken. "I hope she wasn't bothering you," Emily said quickly, her voice defensive but tired. Michael waved it off. "No bother at all. Just having some breakfast. You want some?" Emily shook her head, though Michael could tell she was eyeing the food hungrily. "I'm fine," she muttered. Michael sighed inwardly. Emily's guard was always up, even in these small moments. He understood in a way. Life on the streets must have taught her to trust no one. But the more he saw her with Sarah, the more he started to see cracks in her armor. There was a vulnerability there, one she tried desperately to hide. "Sarah, why don't you finish up in the back while I talk to your mom for a minute?" Michael said gently. Sarah hesitated, but eventually slid off the stool, clutching her bear as she shuffled away. Once she was out of earshot, Michael leaned against the counter, crossing his arms. "You don't have to act like you're walking on eggshells around here, Emily. I meant it when I said you two could stay as long as you need." Emily's eyes flashed with something, gratitude, maybe, but also something darker. I appreciate that, but we won't be here long, she said, her voice tight. I'll find a job soon, I promise. I don't want to be a burden. You're not a burden, Michael replied, his tone firmer now. You're just going through a rough patch. Everyone has those. Emily looked away, clearly uncomfortable with the sympathy. You don't know me, she said quietly. You don't know what I've done. Michael raised an eyebrow, sensing that there was more beneath the surface, but he didn't push. We've all made mistakes, Emily. Doesn't mean you don't deserve a second chance. She didn't respond, just stared at the floor, her arms wrapped tightly around herself like she was trying to hold herself together. The silence between them grew thick with unspoken pain, but Michael knew better than to force anything. She'd open up when she was ready, or maybe she wouldn't. He couldn't control that. I'll be in the back if you need anything, she muttered, before turning and disappearing down the hallway. Michael watched her go, his mind swirling with questions. What had she done? Why was she so determined to hide? He could see the weight of her secrets bearing down on her, but no matter how heavy they were, she carried them in silence. As he stood alone in the quiet restaurant, Michael realized that his life, too, had become a place filled with empty spaces, voids where joy and hope used to live. And for the first time in months, it felt like those spaces were slowly starting to fill again. A week passed, and life at Blue Moon Diner settled into an unexpected rhythm. Michael spent his days cleaning, organizing, and waiting for buyers who never showed. At night, he'd hear the quiet murmurs of Emily and Sarah from the back room, the occasional soft laughter of a child who seemed to feel safe, if only for a fleeting moment. Emily remained distant, always polite but never fully opening up, as if afraid of letting her guard down too much. One evening, Michael found himself alone in the front of the diner, staring at the stack of bills that seemed to grow taller by the day. He sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. His mind wandered, replaying the brief interactions he'd had with Emily. She was a mystery, her pain obvious but locked behind walls he couldn't scale. Every time he tried to ask about her past, she deflected with quick, vague answers, shutting him out entirely. But tonight, something felt different. The usual tension in the air had shifted, and it wasn't long before he heard soft footsteps approaching from the kitchen. Emily emerged from the shadows, her face pale and drawn, her hands trembling slightly. She stood awkwardly at the edge of the counter, as if debating whether to say something or retreat back into her silence. "You okay?" Michael asked, noticing the tension in her stance. Emily opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Instead, she let out a shaky breath, her gaze darting to the window as though searching for an escape route. Her fingers nervously toyed with the hem of her shirt, a sign that something was on her mind. I need to tell you something," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "About why we ended up here." Michael straightened up, sensing that this was the moment he'd been waiting for. He didn't speak, giving her the space to continue at her own pace. Emily leaned against the counter, her eyes distant, as though she were somewhere else entirely. "Before all of this, I wasn't this," she began, gesturing vaguely to herself. "I had a job, a good one. Actually, I was a financial consultant, working with businesses, helping them manage their money. I had a house, a car, everything that I thought would keep me safe." Michael blinked in surprise. He hadn't expected this. A financial consultant? It didn't match the broken woman standing before him now, worn down by life on the streets. But he stayed quiet, sensing that the story was just beginning. "It all came crashing down when I got involved with the wrong people," she continued, her voice tightening. "I worked for a firm that handled big accounts. Some of my colleagues, people I trusted, started skimming money from clients, little by little. At first, I didn't notice, but when I finally did, it was too late." Her breath hitched as she paused, her hands clenching into fists. Michael could see the weight of guilt she carried, heavier than he'd imagined. "They framed me," Emily said, her voice shaking with anger and bitterness. "Made it look like I was the one stealing from our clients. I didn't even see it coming. One day, I had everything, and the next, I was being questioned by the police, facing charges I couldn't fight. I lost my job, my house, everything. It all spiraled out of control so fast. I barely had time to breathe before I was out on the streets with Sarah. Michael felt a chill run down his spine as he listened. The anger and sadness in Emily's voice were palpable, the scars of betrayal cutting deep. He could only imagine how it felt to lose everything in the blink of an eye, especially when you weren't the one at fault. I tried to fight it, she went on, her voice quieter now, almost as if she were speaking more to herself than to him. I tried to prove I was innocent, but it didn't matter. The people who framed me had power, connections. They buried me while they walked away clean. The silence that followed was suffocating. Michael struggled to find the right words, but nothing seemed adequate in the face of such a devastating confession. "And now?" Michael finally asked, keeping his voice gentle. "Is anyone still after you?" Emily shook her head. "No, the legal stuff is over. But once you're marked like that, it follows you. No one will hire me. No one will even listen to my side of the story. So, here I am, trying to keep my daughter safe and hoping for something to change." Her voice cracked on the last word, and she quickly turned away, wiping at her eyes with the back of her hand. Michael swallowed hard, unsure of what to say. His mind raced as he tried to process everything she had just shared. "Why didn't you tell me this earlier?" he asked quietly. Emily let out a bitter laugh. "Because no one believes me. Why would you? You don't know me, and you have no reason to trust anything I say." Michael frowned, leaning forward. "I believe you," he said, his voice firm. "I do. You wouldn't make up something like that." Emily looked at him then, her eyes wide with surprise, as if she wasn't used to people taking her side. For a moment, Michael thought she might break down completely, but she straightened her posture, pushing her emotions back down beneath the surface. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Michael stood there for a long moment, watching her, feeling a strange sense of connection to this woman who had been through so much. He wanted to say something more, to offer some kind of comfort, but the words wouldn't come. Finally, Emily cleared her throat and took a step back, distancing herself again. "I should get some sleep," she murmured, her tone flat. I thought you deserved to know." She turned to leave, her footsteps light on the tile floor. But just before she reached the kitchen doorway, she paused, glancing back over her shoulder. "I'll be gone by the end of the week," Emily said softly. "You've done enough for us. I don't want to cause you any more trouble." Michael's chest tightened at her words, but he didn't argue. He knew it was pointless. Emily was running from her past, from her pain, from the life that had been ripped away from her, and he couldn't stop her. As she disappeared into the back room, Michael stood alone in the empty diner, his mind swirling with everything she had just revealed. He knew one thing for certain. Emily wasn't just another lost soul. She had been betrayed, torn down by forces beyond her control, and now she was fighting to survive in a world that had turned its back on her. But as he stared at the closed door behind which Emily and Sarah slept, Michael felt an unfamiliar resolve building in his chest. He couldn't fix everything that had gone wrong in her life, but maybe, just maybe, he could help her take back a small piece of it. The week crept forward, and Michael couldn't shake the weight of Emily's story from his mind. Each morning, when he saw her quietly moving through the diner, washing dishes or sweeping the floor, it gnawed at him. She was a woman who had been stripped of everything she once had, yet she kept going, surviving for Sarah's sake. Michael knew he couldn't just stand by and let her slip away, not when he could do something, even if it felt small in the grand scheme of her troubles. One night, after the sun had set and the diner sat bathed in a golden glow from the streetlights outside, Michael sat alone in the kitchen, nursing a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. Emily and Sarah had already retreated to their back room, the sound of soft whispers and shuffling feet a distant echo in the otherwise quiet diner. He knew Emily planned to leave in a few days. She hadn't said much since their conversation about her past, but he could sense the urgency building in her. She was packing up the little she and Sarah had, preparing to disappear once again, but this time, Michael couldn't let it happen, not without a plan. His thoughts were interrupted by the creak of the floorboards. Michael turned, expecting to see Emily heading to the kitchen, but instead, Sarah appeared. She was clutching her teddy bear, her wide eyes looking up at him with a mix of innocence and worry. "Can't sleep?" Michael asked softly. Sarah shook her head, her small feet shuffling as she approached him. Without saying a word, she climbed up onto the stool across from him, resting her teddy bear on the counter between them. Michael watched her, wondering what was going through the mind of such a young child who had seen too much of the world's cruelty already. "I like it here," Sarah said quietly, her voice barely audible. "It's safe." Her words hit Michael like a punch to the gut. Safe. A word that should be taken for granted by a 6-year-old, but for Sarah, it was clearly a luxury. He set down his mug, leaning forward slightly. "You can stay here, you know," he said gently. "You and your mom. No need to leave if you don't want to." Sarah's eyes flickered with hope for a brief second, but then her expression shifted, and she looked down at her bear. "Mom says we can't stay anywhere too long. She says it's not safe." Michael frowned, feeling a heavy sadness settle in his chest. It wasn't right. This child deserved stability, a chance to grow up with the simple joys of school, friends, and a home, not a life spent constantly running, looking over their shoulders. "Your mom's trying to protect you," Michael said softly, his voice laced with understanding. "But maybe this could be different." Sarah didn't answer, just looked at him with those big, thoughtful eyes, as if weighing his words. After a long moment, she slid off the stool and disappeared quietly back into the shadows, leaving Michael alone with his thoughts. The next morning, Michael decided to confront Emily. He couldn't sit idly by and watch them walk out of his life, knowing full well they were heading straight back into the same hopeless cycle. He waited until Sarah had gone outside to play, giving him a rare moment alone with Emily as she washed the breakfast dishes. "Emily," he began, his tone more serious than usual, "we need to talk." She paused, the soapy dish in her hands dripping water into the sink. "If this is about us leaving, I told you." "It's not about that," Michael interrupted, stepping closer. "Well, actually it is, but not the way you think." Emily turned, her eyes wary, like she was bracing herself for an argument. "I don't want to cause you any more trouble, Michael. I told you, we'll be gone soon." "That's exactly what I don't want," Michael said firmly. "You don't have to leave. In fact, I want you and Sarah to stay." Emily's eyes widened slightly, but her expression remained guarded. "Why would you do that? We're just a burden. We're not your responsibility." "You're not a burden," Michael replied, his voice steady. "And I'm not doing this out of pity. You and Sarah deserve better than what you've been through, and I want to help." Emily shook her head, her lips pressing into a thin line. "We can't stay here, Michael. It's not that simple. My past, it follows me, no matter where we go. And if we stay, it'll just catch up to us." Michael took a deep breath, frustration building in his chest. "What exactly are you running from? The people who framed you? The system? Yourself?" Her eyes flickered with something. "Guilt, maybe, or fear." "It's everything," she admitted quietly. "The shame, the fear. Every time I try to settle somewhere, it all comes back. I can't let that happen again." "And what about Sarah?" Michael asked, his voice softening. "She's a kid, Emily. She deserves stability. She deserves a home." Tears welled up in Emily's eyes, but she quickly blinked them away, turning back to the sink to hide her face. "I know," she whispered. "I know she does." Michael stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You don't have to do this alone. I'm offering to help. I know things are hard, but running away isn't the solution. Maybe we can figure something out together." Emily stayed silent for a long time, her shoulders tense, her hands gripping the edge of the sink as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm scared, Michael. I'm scared of what'll happen if we stay. What if they find us?" Michael frowned, stepping even closer. "Who's they? The people from your past?" She didn't answer, but the look in her eyes told him enough. Michael's jaw tightened, his frustration shifting into something more protective. He realized that there was more to Emily's story than she had let on, something darker that she was still running from. But he couldn't press her, not now. "All I'm asking is that you think about it," he said quietly. You don't have to decide right now. Just don't leave without talking to me first, okay? Emily nodded, though it was clear she was still wrestling with her fear. Michael wanted to push further, to demand that she stay and let him help, but he knew it wouldn't work. Emily had spent too many years running, too many nights alone with her thoughts. It would take time for her to trust again, time that neither of them had much of. Later that night, after Sarah had gone to bed and Emily had retreated to the back room, Michael found himself sitting in the kitchen again, the silence pressing down on him. He stared at the empty plates on the counter, the remnants of dinner left behind. For the first time in a long time, the diner felt less like a hollow shell and more like a home. And it wasn't just because of Emily and Sarah. It was because, for the first time, he felt like he had a purpose beyond his own survival. As he cleaned up the dishes, his thoughts drifted to the future. The diner was still for sale, and the bills weren't going away. But somehow, those problems didn't feel as insurmountable anymore. Not compared to what Emily and Sarah had been through. Michael made a silent promise to himself. He wouldn't let them fall through the cracks again. He didn't know how, but he'd figure out a way to help them. They had given him something to fight for, and for that, he owed them more than just a place to sleep. He owed them a second chance. It was nearing midnight when Michael was jolted awake by the sound of something clattering in the back of the diner. His heart pounded as he sat up, disoriented in the darkness of his small apartment above the restaurant. For a second, he thought he might have imagined it, but then came another sound, a soft metallic click, like someone handling tools. He glanced at the clock on his nightstand. 12:15 a.m. Who would be in the diner this late? It had to be Emily or Sarah. Maybe one of them couldn't sleep and had wandered into the kitchen. But something about the sounds didn't sit right with him. Throwing on a shirt, Michael hurried downstairs, moving as quietly as possible. The closer he got to the kitchen, the louder the sounds became. Shuffling feet, the clink of metal. His gut twisted in knots. He wasn't sure what he expected to find, but every nerve in his body was on high alert. He rounded the corner and froze in the doorway. The sight before him knocked the breath from his lungs. Emily was crouched beside the large metal cabinet where he kept the restaurant's most important documents and his emergency cash. The drawer was slightly open, and she had one hand inside, rifling through the papers, while the other held a small metal tool that looked suspiciously like a lock-pick. Her face was pale, her brow furrowed in concentration, and she hadn't noticed him yet. For a long moment, Michael just stood there, his mind reeling. He wanted to believe his eyes were playing tricks on him, that this wasn't happening. But there it was, the undeniable reality of what she was doing. "Emily," he said, his voice tight with shock and hurt. She jumped, dropping the tool with a clatter as her head snapped toward him. Her face drained of color, eyes wide like a deer caught in headlights. "Michael, He couldn't speak, his throat constricting with a mix of disbelief and betrayal. For days, he had opened his doors to her, to Sarah. He had believed her story, her pain, and now this? The woman he had trusted. No, the woman he had wanted to save, was stealing from him. "Michael, it's not what it looks like," Emily stammered, scrambling to her feet. "I wasn't." "Then what is it?" he interrupted, his voice rising in anger. "Because from where I'm standing, it sure as hell looks like you were about to rob me." Emily flinched at his words, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Please, just listen to me. I wasn't trying to steal." "Then why were you picking the lock?" Michael's voice was cold, the disbelief giving way to a wave of fury he could barely contain. His mind flashed with memories of every kind word, every ounce of help he had given her, only to be met with this betrayal. Emily's voice broke. She took a step toward him, hands shaking. "I was looking for something, but it's not what you think. I wasn't after your money." "Then what?" Michael demanded, his eyes narrowing. "What the hell were you looking for?" Emily swallowed hard, tears spilling over as she tried to speak. "The documents. The financials for the diner." I was trying to help you." Michael blinked, the anger still coursing through him, but now mingled with confusion. "What?" "I wasn't lying to you about my past," she said, her voice trembling but desperate to make him understand. "I was a financial consultant, and I saw something in your records a few days ago. There's an error, something big, something that could save this place. I didn't want to say anything until I was sure, so I came down here tonight to double-check." Michael stared at her, his mind racing to keep up with her explanation. "You expect me to believe that?" His voice was sharp, cutting through the tense air between them. "You were breaking into my locked cabinet in the middle of the night, and you want me to believe you were just trying to help?" "Yes," she whispered, her voice pleading. "I know how this looks, Michael, but I swear to you, I wasn't trying to steal. I was going to tell you everything tomorrow. I just didn't think you'd believe me if I said I could fix this place. I wanted proof first." He opened his mouth to argue, but something in her eyes stopped him. The desperation there wasn't just fear of getting caught. It was the same desperation she'd had when she first arrived at his door, asking for a place to stay. And beneath it, there was something else, a glimmer of hope. Michael shook his head, trying to push past the whirlwind of emotions clouding his thoughts. "You should have just told me," he said, his voice strained. "Why didn't you trust me?" Emily wiped her tears, her hands still trembling. "Because no one ever does. No one ever believes me when I say I want to make things right." Silence hung between them, thick and suffocating. Michael wanted to stay angry, wanted to throw her out for what she had done, but deep down, he knew there was truth in her words. He had seen it in her eyes from the beginning, the pain of someone who had lost everything and was still fighting to survive. But that didn't erase the fact that she had lied, that she had broken his trust. "So what now?" Michael asked, his voice softer, but still edged with hurt. "You've seen the numbers. What's this big mistake that's going to magically fix everything?" Emily hesitated, clearly sensing the fragility of the situation, then took a deep breath and launched into an explanation. "Your accountant, whoever handled your finances before, missed a major tax deduction. It's buried in the fine print, but I noticed it when I was organizing the papers last week. If we file an amended return for the past 2 years, you could get a refund. A big one, big enough to get you out of debt and keep the diner running." Michael's heart pounded in his chest, each beat harder than the last. He wanted to believe her, wanted to trust that this wasn't just another lie to cover her tracks. But the betrayal was still fresh, his instinct screaming at him not to fall for it again. "You really think this will work?" he asked, his voice skeptical but with the faintest hint of hope. "I know it will," Emily said, her voice gaining strength. "I've done this before. I was good at my job, Michael. Really good. I just need a chance to prove it." Michael stood there for what felt like an eternity, weighing his options. He could kick her out, send her and Sarah back to the streets and never think about them again. Or he could take a leap of faith, one more gamble in a life that had been nothing but losses lately. Finally, he let out a long, exhausted breath. "Okay," he said, his voice rough. "Show me." Emily's eyes widened in shock. You believe me?" "I don't know what I believe," Michael replied, running a hand through his hair. "But if there's a chance, any chance that you're right, I'll take it. I don't have much left to lose." The tension between them eased slightly, but the betrayal still hung in the air like a fog neither of them could shake. Michael turned away, heading toward the office where the financial documents were kept. "Come on," he said, his voice gruff. "Let's see if you can actually pull this off." As Emily followed him into the office, Michael couldn't help but feel a flicker of something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Enjoying the video? Subscribe to our channel to receive more interesting content. Click the subscribe button and stay updated with the latest news. The office was dimly lit, the overhead fluorescent light flickering as Michael and Emily stood in the cramped space. A small desk was cluttered with papers, receipts, and the diner's financial records. An overwhelming mess of numbers and documents that Michael had tried for months to make sense of. Now, he found himself watching as Emily, with a calm precision that belied the tension between them, sifted through the chaos. He still couldn't shake the memory of catching her in the act, crouched beside the locked cabinet, her hands rummaging through his private files. It stung, even now, knowing she had lied, knowing she kept secrets from him. But as she began laying out the papers, explaining her findings with the confidence of someone who knew her way around numbers. That anger slowly gave way to a grudging respect. Emily had been through hell, and she had survived. Maybe, just maybe, she wasn't lying about this either. "Okay, look here," Emily said, pointing to a particular line on a crumpled tax return from 2 years ago. "This is where it all started. Your previous accountant missed a massive business expense you were eligible for. You overpaid your taxes by nearly $20,000. Michael leaned in, squinting at the small text. The numbers blurred together in his tired mind, but the figure she'd mentioned, $20,000, stood out like a beacon in the dark. "20,000?" he repeated, his voice laced with disbelief. That's enough to cover almost everything I owe." Emily nodded, her face serious. "It's not just that year either. There's a similar mistake the following year. If we file amended returns for both years, the refund could easily total over $35,000. Michael blinked, the reality of what she was saying slowly sinking in. $35,000. That wasn't just enough to pay off his debts. It was enough to save the diner, to give him the breathing room he so desperately needed. But as much as he wanted to believe her, a nagging voice in the back of his mind wouldn't let go of his doubt. "You sure about this?" Michael asked, his tone cautious. "I mean, you've already lied to me about a lot of things." Emily flinched at the accusation, but she didn't shy away from it. "I know, and I'm sorry for that, Michael. I should have told you everything from the beginning. She paused, searching for the right words. "I'm not used to people trusting me. After what happened with my job, with everything I lost, I didn't think you'd believe me if I said I could help." Michael studied her, watching the way her hands fidgeted with the edge of the paper, the way her eyes flickered with a mixture of shame and resolve. There was something raw in her honesty now, a vulnerability that hadn't been there before. "I've been burned before too," Michael said after a long pause. His voice was softer now, more reflective. "My wife Rachel, when she passed, I didn't think I'd ever trust anyone again. This place, it was supposed to be our dream. But without her, it just feels like a constant reminder of what I've lost." Emily looked at him, her eyes softening. "I'm sorry, Michael. I can't imagine how hard that must have been." He nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. "It was. And I guess that's why this diner means so much to me. I'm not just trying to save a business. I'm trying to save what's left of her." For a moment, the air between them was thick with shared pain. Two people who had lost everything, trying desperately to hold on to whatever scraps of hope they could find. Michael hadn't realized how similar their stories were until now. They were both broken, both clinging to the last remnants of lives that had been torn apart. "I don't want to lose this place," Michael continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I also can't afford to gamble on something that might not work." Emily straightened, her eyes blazing with determination. "This isn't a gamble, Michael. I wouldn't risk Sarah's safety or your future on a guess. I know this will work. All I need is for you to trust me." Trust. It was such a simple word, but one that carried so much weight. Michael had trusted Emily once and felt the sting of betrayal. But now, seeing her standing before him, laying everything out in the open, he felt a shift. She wasn't the woman he had caught sneaking around in the dark anymore. She was someone fighting just as hard as he was, for her daughter, for a chance at redemption. "I want to trust you," Michael admitted, his voice rough. "I really do." "Then let me prove it," Emily said, her voice firm but pleading. "Let me fix this, and I swear, I'll never let you down again." The sincerity in her eyes was undeniable, and for the first time in a long time, Michael felt the walls he'd built around himself begin to crack. He wanted to believe her. He wanted to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could save this place together. "All right," he said after a long moment, his voice heavy with resignation but tinged with hope. "Let's do it. Let's fix this." Emily exhaled in relief, a small, grateful smile tugging at her lips. "Thank you, Michael. You won't regret this." "I hope not," he muttered, though the weight of the decision still sat heavy on his chest. "So, what do we do next?" Emily immediately launched into action, gathering the necessary forms and explaining the process of filing the amended tax returns. As she worked, Michael watched her with a mix of awe and apprehension. She was sharp, focused, like a different person when she was in her element. It was clear that, before her life had fallen apart, Emily had been exceptional at what she did. As the hours ticked by, the tension between them slowly eased, replaced by a growing sense of partnership. They worked side by side, poring over the numbers, double-checking every detail. For the first time in months, Michael felt like he wasn't alone in this fight. And as strange as it was, he found himself starting to trust her again. But just as they finished the final document, there was a sudden knock at the front door. Michael and Emily both froze, exchanging confused glances. It was well past midnight. No one should have been here. "I'll check it," Michael said, his voice low. He moved toward the door, his heart pounding as he peered through the window. A figure stood outside, barely visible in the dim streetlight. Michael couldn't make out the face, but there was something about the way they stood, rigid, tense, that sent a chill down his spine. He unlocked the door cautiously, opening it just enough to speak. "Can I help you?" The figure stepped forward, revealing a man with a sharp, angular face and cold, calculating eyes. He looked Michael up and down with an expression that sent alarm bells ringing in Michael's head. "I'm here to see Emily," the man said, his voice smooth but dangerous. "Tell her I've found her." Michael's blood ran cold. For the first time since Emily had arrived at the diner, Michael realized there were parts of her story she hadn't told him. And whoever this man was, it was clear that Emily's past had just caught up with her. Michael stood frozen at the door, the cold night air cutting through him as the stranger's words echoed in his head. "Tell her I've found her." His heart pounded in his chest, a rush of adrenaline mixing with confusion and fear. The man standing before him was calm, too calm, and there was something predatory in his eyes. This wasn't just some random visitor. He knew Emily, and Michael didn't need to ask to understand that this man was trouble. He cleared his throat, trying to sound composed. "Who are you?" The man smirked, as if the question amused him. "Let's just say I'm an old acquaintance. Now, if you'll kindly move out of the way, I'd like to speak with Emily." Michael's grip tightened on the door. He wasn't about to let this man anywhere near her, not until he had some answers. "Emily's not here," he lied, his voice steady but firm. "Whatever business you have with her, you can take it somewhere else." The stranger's eyes narrowed, his smirk fading into something darker, more menacing. He stepped closer, his presence overwhelming in the small doorway. "I don't think you understand," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "This isn't a request." Michael's pulse quickened, and his mind raced. He could feel the threat hanging in the air, heavy and undeniable. Whoever this man was, he wasn't leaving without a confrontation. Michael had no idea what Emily had gotten herself into, but he knew one thing. He wasn't about to let this stranger intimidate him, or worse, put Sarah in danger. "I'm telling you, she's not here," Michael repeated, his voice sharper now. "And you need to leave." The man's expression darkened, and for a moment, Michael thought he might lunge forward, but then the stranger's gaze flickered past him, to the inside of the diner. Michael turned his head just enough to see what had caught his attention. Emily was standing in the doorway to the office, her face pale as a ghost, her eyes wide with terror. She had heard everything. The man smiled coldly. "Well, there she is." Michael's blood ran cold. Everything he had feared was now happening, and he wasn't prepared for it. He looked back at Emily, seeing the unmistakable fear etched into her features. This man, whoever he was, wasn't just a part of her past. He was the nightmare she'd been running from. "Emily, stay back," Michael said, his voice firm, but she had already stepped forward, her face tightening into a mask of resolve. "It's okay, Michael," she whispered, though the tremor in her voice betrayed her fear. "I know him." Michael turned to her, his confusion growing. "Who is he?" Emily swallowed hard, her eyes never leaving the stranger's face. "His name is Derek. He worked with the people who framed me. He's part of the reason I lost everything." Derek's smile widened, though it didn't reach his eyes. "She's not wrong," he said, his tone mocking. "But let's not get caught up in old grudges, Emily. I'm not here to rehash the past. I'm here because you have something I want." Michael stepped in front of Emily, blocking Derek's view of her. His protective instincts kicked in full force. "You're not getting anything from her." Derek's gaze flicked to Michael, then back to Emily. "You really think you can hide forever?" he asked, ignoring Michael completely. "This little diner, this charade you've been playing, it's over. I gave you a chance to disappear quietly, but you didn't take it. Now, I'm here to make sure you do." Emily's face paled even more, and Michael could see her hands trembling. She was terrified, but there was something else there too, guilt. He could feel it in the air between them, a tension that had been bubbling beneath the surface since the night she told him about her past. Now, all of it was unraveling, faster than either of them could stop. "What do you want?" Emily asked, her voice strained. Derek stepped forward, his smile disappearing, replaced by a steely, cold expression. "You know what I want. I want the files, Emily. The ones you took before you ran. You think I wouldn't find out? You think I'd let you walk away with all that information?" Michael glanced at Emily, confusion flashing across his face. "Files? What is he talking about?" Emily's breath hitched, and for a second, she couldn't meet Michael's eyes. "I didn't tell you everything," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "When I found out about the fraud at the firm, I took evidence, proof of what they were doing. I thought I could use it to clear my name, but when everything went wrong, I ran. And now, they want it back." Derek's laughter cut through the tense air. "That's a nice way of putting it," he said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "You were supposed to be our fall guy, Emily. You screwed that up when you took those files, and now you're going to pay for it." Michael's heart pounded in his chest, his mind racing to piece everything together. Emily wasn't just a victim of circumstance. She had been caught in something far more dangerous than he'd realized. And now, this man was here to take everything from her, including her life, if it came to that. But Michael wasn't about to let that happen. "Get out," Michael said, his voice cold and commanding. He took a step closer to Derek, squaring his shoulders. "You're not getting anything from her, and you're not going to hurt her or Sarah." Derek's eyes flashed with anger, and for a moment, the air between them crackled with tension. Michael could see the rage boiling beneath Derek's calm exterior, a predator who wasn't used to being defied. But before Derek could respond, Emily stepped forward, her voice stronger than before. "I'll give you what you want, Derek. I'll give you the files." Michael whipped around, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Emily, no." "Michael, I have to," she said, cutting him off. "If I don't give him the files, he'll never stop coming after us. Sarah's in danger. I can't risk that." Derek smiled again, that same cold, predatory smile. "Smart choice." Michael's heart sank, his mind racing for a way out of this. But before he could speak, Emily stepped closer to Derek, her expression hardening. "But you have to promise, once I give you the files, you leave us alone. You never come near me or Sarah again." Derek tilted his head, considering her words for a moment, before nodding. "Fine, you have my word." Michael didn't believe him for a second, and he could see the doubt flicker in Emily's eyes as well. But she was out of options, and Michael knew it. They both were. "Where are they?" Derek asked, his voice impatient. Emily swallowed hard, then nodded toward the back of the diner. "In the office. I'll get them." She turned, her face tight with fear and determination, and Michael followed, his chest tightening with every step. He wanted to stop her, to protect her, but he knew that in this moment, there was no easy way out. Inside the office, Emily moved quickly, pulling open a drawer and retrieving a small USB drive. She held it tightly in her hand for a moment, her knuckles white, before she finally turned back to Michael. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I never wanted to drag you into this." Michael's heart ached as he watched her, knowing she was doing this to protect Sarah, to protect him. "We'll figure this out," he said, his voice soft but filled with resolve. "We'll find a way to make this right." Emily nodded, but her eyes were filled with doubt. She handed him the drive, her fingers brushing against his for just a moment before she turned away, heading back toward the front where Derek waited. As they approached, Derek's eyes lit up when he saw the drive in her hand. "That's more like it," he said, extending his hand to take it, But before Emily could give it to him, the front door suddenly burst open, and Sarah stood there, her face flushed with fear. "Mommy!" she cried, rushing toward Emily. Emily dropped the drive, her arms immediately wrapping around Sarah, pulling her close. Derek's eyes narrowed, his smile disappearing as the situation spiraled out of control. Michael saw the opportunity and grabbed the drive off the floor, his heart pounding as Derek lunged forward, fury etched across his face. "Give me that," Derek snarled, his calm facade finally shattered. But Michael wasn't about to let him win. The storm had finally broken, and there was no turning back. The air in the diner crackled with tension. Michael's fingers tightened around the small USB drive as Derek advanced, his eyes blazing with fury. Every instinct in Michael screamed that this was a fight they couldn't win, but he wasn't about to back down. Not when Sarah and Emily's lives were on the line. "Give it to me, Michael," Derek snarled, his voice dangerously low, as if every ounce of restraint was hanging by a thread. "You have no idea what you're getting yourself into." Michael took a step back, his heart pounding so loudly in his ears that it drowned out everything else. "I know exactly what you're trying to do," he shot back, his voice stronger than he felt inside. "And I'm not letting you destroy her life again." Derek's lips curled into a twisted smirk, his hand reaching inside his jacket. "You think this is some kind of game? You're just a washed-up diner owner. You don't know what you're playing with." But before Michael could react, a glint of metal appeared in Derek's hand, a gun. Michael's stomach dropped. The sight of the weapon sent a wave of cold fear rushing through him, and for a moment, time seemed to slow. He caught Emily's terrified gaze, her arms wrapped protectively around Sarah, the girl's face buried in her mother's chest. Derek pointed the gun at Michael, his eyes dark with intent. "Now, hand it over." Michael's hands shook, but he didn't move. His mind raced, trying to figure a way out of this without anyone getting hurt. But there was no easy solution. He had no idea what kind of man Derek truly was, but everything about him screamed danger. This wasn't someone who made empty threats. "I can't do that," Michael said, his voice quiet but steady. He had to buy them time, had to find a way to get Emily and Sarah out of there safely. "You've already taken everything from her. You're not taking this too." Derek's eyes narrowed, his patience clearly wearing thin. "This isn't a negotiation, Davis. If you don't hand over that drive, I'll make sure you regret it." Emily clutched Sarah tighter, tears streaming down her face. "Michael, please." But Michael wasn't listening. His thoughts were laser-focused on Derek, on the gun, on the overwhelming fear that this was it, the moment everything could come crashing down. "I'll give you the drive," Michael said suddenly, his tone shifting, his gaze locking onto Derek's. "But you have to let them go first. Emily and Sarah. Let them walk out of here. Then you'll get what you came for." Derek's smirk returned, but there was a glint of something dangerous in his eyes. "You're not in a position to be making demands." "I'm not negotiating for me," Michael replied, his voice hardening. "I'm negotiating for them. You let them go, or I'll destroy this thing right now." He held the drive up, his thumb hovering over it like he was ready to snap it in half. For a moment, Derek's expression faltered. He wasn't used to people standing up to him, Michael realized. He was used to control, to fear being his greatest weapon. But Michael wasn't afraid anymore, not for himself. He couldn't be. Derek's hand tightened on the gun, but he didn't pull the trigger. Instead, he let out a sharp, frustrated breath and glanced at Emily. "Fine," he spat, waving the gun toward the door. "They can go. But you?" He turned back to Michael, his voice dripping with venom. "Aren't going anywhere." Michael's chest tightened, but he nodded. He didn't care what happened to him, as long as Emily and Sarah were safe. He glanced at Emily, giving her a look that said it's okay. "Go," Michael urged. "Take Sarah and get out of here." Emily hesitated, her face stricken with fear and guilt. "Michael, I can't just leave you." "You can, and you will," Michael insisted, his voice soft but firm. "Get her somewhere safe. I'll be fine." Tears welled in Emily's eyes, but she knew there was no other choice. She grabbed Sarah's hand, pulling her toward the door. The little girl looked back at Michael, her eyes wide with confusion and fear, but Emily kept moving, her breath ragged as she pushed the door open and disappeared into the night. The moment the door shut behind them, Michael felt a sense of relief wash over him. At least they were out of danger. At least he had bought them time. But now, it was just him and Derek. The man's face twisted with rage, his gun still trained on Michael. "You think you're some kind of hero?" Derek sneered, stepping closer. "You think you can stop me?" Michael stood his ground, the drive still clenched tightly in his hand. "I don't care what you think. I care about making sure you never get your hands on this." Derek's eyes darkened. "You have no idea what's on that drive, do you? You're playing with fire, Davis. You don't know the kind of people you're dealing with." "Maybe not," Michael admitted, his voice calm despite the fear gnawing at him. "But I know what kind of man you are, and I'm not letting you ruin anyone else's life." Derek's smile faded completely, replaced by a cold, calculating expression. "You think you're brave," he said, taking a step closer, the gun now only inches from Michael's chest. "But bravery doesn't mean a damn thing when you're dead." Michael's heart pounded, his pulse deafening in his ears, but he refused to look away. "Maybe not," he said quietly, "but I'm not afraid of you." Derek's finger twitched on the trigger, and for a split second, Michael braced himself for the worst. But before Derek could pull the trigger, there was a sudden crash from behind them. The back door of the diner burst open, and 2 police officers rushed in, guns drawn. "Drop the weapon!" one of them shouted, their voices sharp and commanding. Derek froze, his face twisting with fury as he realized his plan had unraveled. He hesitated for a moment, his grip tightening on the gun as though he were weighing his options. But with the police closing in, he knew there was no escape. Slowly, Derek raised his hands, the gun slipping from his grasp and clattering to the floor. "Down on the ground," the officer ordered, stepping forward. Derek glared at Michael one last time, his eyes filled with venom, before dropping to his knees and placing his hands behind his head. The police moved quickly, securing Derek and pulling him out of the diner. The moment he was gone, Michael felt the adrenaline rush drain from his body, leaving him weak and shaking. He collapsed into a nearby chair, his head spinning. It was over, at least for now. Emily and Sarah were safe, and Derek was finally out of their lives. But the weight of what had just happened, what they had all narrowly escaped, hung heavy in the air. The door to the diner creaked open again, and Emily rushed in, her face pale and streaked with tears. She ran to Michael, falling to her knees beside him. "Michael, oh my God, are you okay?" she gasped, her hands shaking as she reached for him. Michael gave her a tired smile, his voice hoarse. "I'm fine. You got out." Emily nodded, her breath hitching with relief. The police, they were already on their way. Someone must have seen Derek lurking around the diner. They showed up just in time. Michael let out a long, shaky breath, the tension finally beginning to ease. "Thank God." Emily's hands trembled as she reached for his, her eyes brimming with tears. "I thought I was going to lose you." Michael squeezed her hand, his heart swelling with emotion. "You're not going to lose me, Emily. Not now. Not ever." For a moment, they just sat there in the dimly lit diner, their hands clasped together, the weight of everything they had been through finally crashing down on them. It wasn't over, not yet, but they had survived. And for the first time in a long time, Michael felt like they had a chance to build something new, something worth fighting for, together. In the days following Derek's arrest, the diner felt eerily quiet. The rush of adrenaline that had kept Michael going through the ordeal had faded, leaving only a dull exhaustion in its wake. He had tried to push the events of that night to the back of his mind, but the memories lingered, Derek's cold stare, the gun, the fear that had wrapped itself around all of them. Emily hadn't said much since then. She spent most of her time with Sarah, trying to regain a sense of normalcy, but Michael could see the weight she was carrying. The fear of what could have happened hung over her like a dark cloud, and every time their eyes met, he saw the guilt swimming beneath the surface. It had been 2 days since the police had taken Derek away, and Michael was sitting alone in the diner's back office, sorting through papers. The USB drive Emily had risked everything to keep from Derek sat on the desk in front of him, untouched. He had no idea what was on it, but whatever it was It had been important enough for Derek to show up with a gun. As he reached for the drive, the door creaked open and Emily stepped inside, her expression hesitant. "Hey," she said quietly, lingering in the doorway. Michael looked up, his exhaustion momentarily forgotten. "Hey." She shifted nervously on her feet, her eyes darting to the USB drive on the desk. "I see you haven't looked at it yet." Michael glanced at the drive and then back at her. "No, I wanted to make sure you were ready before I did." Emily took a deep breath and crossed the room, sitting down across from him. She folded her hands in her lap, staring at the drive as though it were a bomb waiting to go off. "I don't even know what's on it anymore," she admitted. "I took it so long ago, thinking it was the key to clearing my name. But now..." Her voice trailed off, and she shook her head. "Now I just want to move on. I want this to be over." Michael reached across the desk, resting his hand on top of hers. "It's over, Emily. Derek's gone. He can't hurt you or Sarah anymore." "I know," she whispered, though her eyes still held a flicker of doubt. "But what if there are others? What if this isn't the end?" Michael squeezed her hand, his voice steady and reassuring. "Then we'll face them. Together." Emily looked up at him, her eyes glassy with unshed tears. "You shouldn't have to face my problems, Michael. You've already done enough. More than enough." "I'm not just doing this for you," Michael said softly. "I'm doing it for Sarah too. She deserves a chance at a normal life. And you deserve a fresh start." Emily's breath hitched, and for a moment, she looked like she might cry, but she quickly blinked away the tears. "I don't know how to thank you," she said, her voice shaky, "for everything. I don't know how I can ever repay you." Michael shook his head, smiling faintly. "You don't need to repay me. We're in this together now. Whatever comes next, we'll figure it out." For a long moment, they sat in silence, the weight of everything that had happened pressing down on them. Emily stared at the USB drive, her fingers twitching as though she wanted to pick it up, but couldn't bring herself to. Finally, she exhaled deeply and pushed it across the desk toward him. "I think you should have it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't want it anymore. Whatever's on it, it's in the past. I want to move forward." Michael hesitated, glancing at the drive before nodding. He picked it up, feeling its cold, hard edges between his fingers. He could sense the finality in her words, the desire to leave behind everything that had brought her to this point. Emily had carried the weight of her past for so long, and now she was ready to let it go. "Okay," he said quietly, pocketing the drive. "We'll move forward. Together." Emily gave him a small, grateful smile, and for the first time in days, Michael saw a flicker of hope in her eyes. That night, Michael found himself standing in the kitchen, staring at the stove as the smell of cooking filled the air. It was a simple meal, spaghetti, garlic bread, but the familiar scent reminded him of better times, when Blue Moon Diner had been full of life. The sound of laughter, the clinking of silverware against plates, the steady hum of conversations. Those days felt like a lifetime ago. But tonight, something was different. Emily and Sarah were sitting at one of the booths, their heads bent together as they colored in one of Sarah's sketchbooks. Sarah's laughter filled the diner, bright and unburdened, a stark contrast to the fear that had haunted them just days ago. Emily smiled at her daughter, her eyes soft with love and relief. Michael watched them from the kitchen, a strange warmth filling his chest. It wasn't the same as it had been with Rachel. Nothing could ever replace that. But it was something new, something he hadn't realized he needed. Family. When the food was ready, he carried the plates out to the booth, setting them down in front of Emily and Sarah. Sarah immediately dug in, her little face lighting up as she twirled the spaghetti around her fork. "Thanks, Michael," she chirped, her mouth full of noodles. Michael chuckled. "Slow down, kiddo. There's plenty." Emily smiled at him, the tension in her shoulders finally easing as she picked up her fork. "It smells amazing," she said softly. "I haven't had a real meal like this in a long time." "Well, get used to it," Michael said, sliding into the booth across from them, "because there's more where that came from." They ate together, the conversation flowing easily, laughter bubbling up between bites. For the first time since Emily and Sarah had come into his life, Michael felt like things might actually be okay. They had survived the worst of it, and now, sitting here in the diner with them, it felt like a new beginning. As the night wore on and Sarah's eyes began to droop with exhaustion, Emily leaned back in the booth, her gaze settling on Michael. There was something different in her expression, something warm, something unspoken. It wasn't just gratitude anymore. It was something deeper, something that neither of them had expected. "Michael," she began, her voice soft, hesitant. "I don't know what I would have done without you. You saved us. And I don't want to lose this. I don't want to lose you." Michael felt his heart skip a beat, the words hanging in the air between them. He had been so focused on protecting her, on saving the diner, that he hadn't realized how much she had come to mean to him. But now, looking into her eyes, he knew. "You're not going to lose me," he said, his voice steady, filled with a certainty he hadn't felt in years. "We're in this together. No more running." Emily's eyes glistened with tears, but this time, they weren't tears of fear or pain. They were tears of relief, of hope. For the first time in years, Michael felt like he had found something worth holding on to. And as Emily reached across the table to take his hand, he knew they were no longer just survivors. They were building something new, something stronger than the past, stronger than the fear that had once gripped them both. They were family. We hope you were moved and inspired by our story. We want to hear your opinion. Leave a comment below, share your impressions, and your own stories of resilience and hope. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss our next emotional videos. Join us on this journey and follow more incredible stories. See you next time.